When Emma begged the janitor to accompany her to the chancellor's gala, she thought she'd hit rock bottom. 24 hours later, she discovered the man in the maintenance uniform had the power to destroy the entire university administration. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The scholarship letter trembled in Emma Rodriguez's hands. Not from excitement, but from the crushing weight of an impossible choice. She stood in the narrow hallway of Westbridge University's science building, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of anxious bees that matched the feeling in her chest. The letter was an invitation to the Chancellor's Gala, a glittering evening where the university's most prestigious scholarship, the Fulbright Ashford Foundation Award, would be announced. Emma was one of 5 finalists. It was everything she had worked for. Everything she needed. The scholarship would mean she could finally stop working 3 part-time jobs, stop choosing between textbooks and groceries, stop feeling the constant gnawing anxiety of being one emergency away from dropping out entirely. But there was a catch, and it was printed in elegant script at the bottom of the cream-colored cardstock. Formal attire required, plus 1 guest mandatory for all finalists. She read those words again, hoping they might somehow rearrange themselves into something more forgiving. They didn't. The gala was in 6 days. She had no formal dress, no money to buy one, and absolutely no one to bring as a date. Her roommate had already left for winter break. Her few friends from class were scattered across the country visiting family, and asking someone she barely knew felt like admitting a vulnerability she couldn't afford to show. Emma was the girl who had it together, the one who smiled through exhaustion, who never complained about the hand life had dealt her. Asking for help felt like peeling back her skin and showing everyone just how fragile she really was underneath. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her second-hand backpack, the one with the broken zipper she'd repaired with safety pins. The scent of lemon cleaner drifted through the hallway, sharp and clean, cutting through her spiraling thoughts. She looked up and saw him. Marcus Allen, the night janitor, was methodically mopping the far end of the corridor, his movements slow and purposeful, almost meditative. He always worked late, when the building was nearly empty, when the chaos of students had faded into a peaceful quiet. Emma had seen him countless times over the past 2 years, always in the same dark blue maintenance uniform, always with the same gentle expression that somehow made the sterile academic hallways feel a little less lonely. Over time, they had developed an easy friendship, the kind that existed in the margins of life. A friendly nod when she stayed late studying, a shared smile when she nearly tripped over her own feet rushing to class. Once, when she'd been crying in the stairwell after failing a chemistry midterm, he had simply sat down 2 steps below her, not saying a word, just offering the quiet solidarity of another human being who understood that sometimes life was hard. After a while, he'd told her that failure wasn't the opposite of success, it was just a comma in a longer sentence. She had never forgotten that. There was something about Marcus that felt different from everyone else in her life. He didn't look at her with pity or judgment. He didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. He just saw her, really saw her, and treated her with a respect that was increasingly rare in a world where people were constantly sizing each other up, measuring worth by appearances and achievements. Emma stood there in the empty hallway watching him work, and a wild, desperate idea began to take shape in her mind. It was absurd. It was inappropriate. It was probably the worst idea she'd ever had, but it was also her only option. She started walking toward him before she could talk herself out of it. Her footsteps echoed on the polished floor. Marcus looked up as she approached, his dark eyes warm and curious. He leaned the mop against the wall and pulled a cleaning rag from his belt, wiping his hands with the careful attention he seemed to bring to everything he did. "Good evening, Miss Rodriguez," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that always made her think of old jazz records. "Burning the midnight oil again?" Emma tried to smile, but it came out shaky and uncertain. She clutched the straps of her backpack like a lifeline. "Hi, Marcus. I was actually hoping I could talk to you about something." "Of course," he said, gesturing to a nearby bench that sat beneath a large window overlooking the darkened campus. His willingness to stop working, to simply listen, made her throat tighten with emotion. She sat down, and he settled onto the bench beside her, a respectful distance away, his posture open and patient. "This is gonna sound crazy," Emma began, her words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "And please feel free to say no. I will completely understand. I won't be offended. It's just that I'm in this situation and I don't have anyone else to ask, and you've always been so kind to me." Marcus's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Take your breath," he said gently. "Whatever it is, just say it." She pulled the invitation from her backpack and handed it to him. He took it carefully, his calloused fingers handling the expensive paper with surprising delicacy. He read it slowly, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'm one of 5 finalists for a full scholarship," Emma explained, her voice steadier now that she'd started. "It would change my life, Marcus. I could actually finish my degree without drowning in debt. I could focus on school instead of working every spare hour. I could maybe even have a future that doesn't involve choosing between rent and food." He looked up from the letter, his eyes searching hers. "That's incredible, Emma. You should be very proud." "I am," she said, and then her voice cracked. "There's a mandatory formal dinner, and I have to bring a guest, and it's in 6 days." and I don't have anyone. My family's back in Texas and they can't afford to fly out, and my roommate is gone. I've thought about every single person I know and there's just no one. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to look directly at him. So I'm asking you, would you be my date to the Chancellor's Gala? The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Emma felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She was asking the janitor, a man who spent his nights mopping floors and emptying trash cans, to accompany her to the most important event of her academic life. It was humiliating. It was desperate. It was also the most honest thing she'd done in years. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just a scared young woman asking for help from the one person who had always treated her with unconditional kindness. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting from the invitation to the window where the campus lights twinkled in the darkness like scattered stars. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. She prepared herself for the gentle rejection, for the awkward explanation of why this was impossible, for the inevitable shift in their easy friendship that would make every future encounter painfully uncomfortable. But when Marcus finally spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful, and his words were not what she expected. "Why me, Emma?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "Because you're the kindest person I know," she said simply. "Because you've never made me feel small or less than. Because when I'm around you, I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not, and because I trust you." The last words came out as barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. Marcus turned to look at her fully, and for a fleeting moment, Emma saw something flicker across his face. It was a complicated expression, layered with emotions she couldn't quite read. There was surprise, yes, but also something that looked almost like pain, or maybe regret, or perhaps a deep buried sadness. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual calm, gentle demeanor. He reached out and gently took the invitation from where it rested between them on the bench. Formal attire, he read aloud, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I assume that means I can't show up in my work uniform." Emma let out a surprised laugh, tension in her chest loosening just a fraction. "No. Probably not. Do you even own a suit? I might be able to find something appropriate," he said, and there was a hint of amusement in his tone that she'd never heard before. It felt like he was sharing a private joke with himself. "6 days, you said?" She nodded, hardly daring to believe what seemed to be happening. Marcus carefully refolded the invitation and handed it back to her. "Then yes, Emma Rodriguez. I would be honored to be your date to the dance." The relief that washed over her was so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She quickly blinked them away, not wanting to fall apart in front of him. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." He stood up, retrieving his mop from where it leaned against the wall. "I think I might have some idea," he said quietly. There was something in his tone, a weight of unspoken history that made Emma wonder, not for the first time, who Marcus Allen really was beneath the maintenance uniform and the humble, unassuming exterior. But she didn't ask. Everyone was entitled to their secrets, and Marcus had just given her the greatest gift anyone could offer: hope. As he returned to his work, pushing the mop across the gleaming floor in smooth, practiced strokes, Emma sat on the bench and watched him. She had no idea that her simple, desperate invitation had just set in motion a series of events that would unravel carefully constructed lies, expose hidden truths, and reveal that the man she thought she knew was someone else entirely, someone whose real identity would leave not just her but the entire university absolutely speechless. The next morning, Emma woke up in her cramped dorm room with a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. It took her a moment to identify it, this strange lightness in her chest that made breathing feel easier. It was relief tinged with the faintest hint of excitement. She actually had a date to the gala. The impossible hurdle had been cleared, and now she could focus on the next challenge, finding something appropriate to wear that wouldn't require selling a kidney on the black market. She pulled out her laptop and began searching thrift stores in the area, making a mental list of places she could visit between her shift at the campus library and her evening tutoring sessions. The gala was in 5 days now, and time was running out. But for the first time in weeks, the panic that had been her constant companion had quieted to a manageable hum. She had taken action. She had asked for help, and someone had said yes. That alone felt like a small miracle. Across campus, in a modest apartment building that most students didn't even know existed, Marcus Allen stood in front of his bathroom mirror, razor in hand, and stared at his own reflection. The face looking back at him was one he'd carefully crafted over the past 3 years. The close-cropped beard that added 10 years to his appearance, the wire-rimmed glasses he didn't actually need but wore religiously, the perpetually tired expression of a man who worked nights and kept his head down. It was a good disguise. It had served its purpose. But in 5 days, he would have to step back into a world he'd fled, and the carefully constructed walls of his new identity would be tested in ways he wasn't sure he was ready for. Marcus Alexander Laurent, that was his real name, though only a handful of people in the world knew it anymore. 3 years ago, he had been the youngest tenured professor in Westbridge University's history, a celebrated economist whose research on wealth inequality had earned him international recognition, speaking engagements at the World Economic Forum, and a 6-figure salary that seemed obscene given his working-class upbringing. He had been interviewed by major news networks, courted by prestigious think tanks, and offered positions at Ivy League institutions that most academics could only dream of. He had been successful, respected, and absolutely miserable. The pressure had been crushing. The constant demand for new publications, the political maneuvering of academic politics, the endless parade of donor dinners where he was expected to perform like a trained seal, spouting sound bites about economic policy while wealthy benefactors patted themselves on the back for their philanthropy. But the final straw had come during a faculty gala much like the one Emma had invited him to. He'd been seated next to a hedge fund manager who'd spent the entire evening explaining why poverty was essentially a choice, why the poor simply needed to work harder, why wealth redistribution was theft. Marcus had listened, his jaw clenched, as this man who'd inherited his fortune disparaged the very people Marcus had grown up with, the people whose struggles had fueled his entire career. When he'd finally spoken up, suggesting that perhaps systemic inequality played a role in economic outcomes, the hedge fund manager had laughed and said something that had cut through every pretension, every illusion Marcus had been clinging. You can put on the fancy suit and eat at the nice table, but you'll always be the janitor's son pretending to belong here. The words had been meant as an insult, but they'd sparked something else entirely, a realization that in climbing the ladder of academic success, he'd left behind the only part of himself that had ever felt real. His father had been a custodian at a community college, a man who'd worked nights to put food on the table and who'd taught Marcus that dignity had nothing to do with the size of your paycheck. His father had died of a heart attack when Marcus was 20, collapsing in an empty hallway he'd just finished mopping, and no one had found him for 3 hours. Within a month of that gala, Marcus had resigned. He'd walked away from tenure, from his research, from the life everyone told him he should want. He'd sold his condo, donated most of his belongings, and applied for a custodial position at the same university where he'd once been a celebrated faculty member. The administration had been so large, the turnover so constant, that no one in human resources had recognized his name or made the connection. He'd been hired as just another night janitor, invisible and unremarkable. And for 3 years, he'd been happier than he'd ever been in his previous life. He worked with his hand. He had time to think. He read philosophy in the quiet hours of his shift. He helped students like Emma, offering small kindnesses that asked for nothing in return. He'd found peace in simplicity and anonymity, and finally living according to his father's values instead of the world's expectations. But accepting Emma's invitation meant walking back into that world, even if just for one evening. It meant the risk of being recognized, of his carefully constructed new life being exposed, of having to answer questions he didn't want to answer. He'd almost said no. The word had been right there on his tongue, but then he'd seen the desperate hope in her eyes, the vulnerability in her voice when she'd said she trusted him, and he'd known he couldn't refuse. Emma reminded him of himself at that age. Brilliant and hardworking, but trapped by circumstances beyond her control, fighting a system designed to keep people like them in their place. If attending one gala could help her escape that trap, then he would do it, even if it meant risking everything he'd built. Marcus set down the razor and reached for the bottom drawer of his dresser, the one he never opened anymore. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the Tom Ford suit he'd worn to his last faculty dinner, a perfectly tailored charcoal gray that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. He pulled it out and laid it on the bed, watching as the fabric fell in elegant folds that spoke of quality and wealth. It still fit perfectly. He'd tried it on once, about a year ago, in a moment of weakness or nostalgia, he wasn't sure which. Staring at it now, he felt the weight of two lives pressing against each other, the past and the present colliding in a way he'd hoped to avoid forever. He carefully hung the suit on the back of his closet door and returned to his reflection in the mirror. 5 days. He had 5 days to prepare himself for the performance of a lifetime, to walk back into the university's grand ballroom as both Marcus Allen, the humble janitor, and Marcus Alexander Laurent, the ghost used to be. Emma spent the next 3 days in a whirlwind of preparation that felt equal parts exciting and terrifying. She'd found a dress at a consignment shop, a deep emerald green gown that had probably cost someone a fortune but was being sold for $40 because of a small tear in the hem that Emma had carefully repaired with a needle and thread borrowed from the dorm's community closet. It wasn't perfect, but when she tried it on in the cramped dressing room, she'd actually gasped at her own reflection. She looked like someone who belonged at a gala, someone confident and put together, someone who might actually win a prestigious scholarship. She'd also been gathering information about the event, trying to prepare herself for what to expect. The Chancellor's Gala was apparently the social event of the academic year, attended by the university's Board of Trustees, major donors, distinguished faculty, and a carefully curated selection of students who represented the institution's commitment to excellence and diversity. Emma knew she was there to be displayed, proof that Westbridge University cared about first-generation college students from underprivileged backgrounds. It should have made her angry being used as a prop in the university's public relations performance, but she was too pragmatic to let pride get in the way of opportunity. If they wanted to parade her around to make themselves feel good, fine. As long as she got the scholarship at the end of it, she would smile and play her part. What worried her more was Marcus. She kept replaying their conversation, analyzing his response, wondering if he'd only said yes out of pity or obligation. She didn't want to be a burden to him. She didn't want him to spend money he probably didn't have on renting a tuxedo or feel uncomfortable in a setting where he might be the only custodial staff member attending as a guest rather than working. The social dynamics made her anxious. Would people look down on her for bringing a janitor as her date? Would it hurt her chances of winning the scholarship? Would Marcus feel out of place or judged? These thoughts circled in her mind like vultures, picking at her confidence. On the fourth day before the gala, she saw him again. It was late evening, and she was leaving the library after a long shift of reshelving books and helping undergraduates navigate the database system. Marcus was cleaning the main entrance, and when he saw her, he smiled that gentle, knowing smile that always made her feel seen. She walked over, clutching her backpack straps, suddenly shy. "Hey," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. "I just wanted to check in. About Saturday. If you've changed your mind, I completely understand. I know it's probably not your usual scene." Marcus stopped what he was doing and gave her his full attention. "Have you changed your mind about wanting me there?" Asked. "No," Emma said quickly. "Not at all. I just don't want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable." He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Emma, I'm going to tell you something my father once told me. He said that dignity isn't about where you sit at the table. It's about how you carry yourself, no matter where you are. I'm not worried about fitting in. I'm only concerned about being there for you the way you need me to be." His words, spoken with such calm certainty, dissolved her anxiety like sugar in warm water. She felt tears prick at her eyes and quickly blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Saturday," Marcus said, and there was something different in his voice, a quiet intensity she'd never heard before. "I'll meet you in front of the Humanities building at 6. Wear something that makes you feel strong." She nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "I will." As she walked away, Marcus watched her go, and for just a moment he allowed himself to drop the carefully neutral expression he always wore. His jaw tightened. His eyes hardened with a determination that would have shocked anyone who knew him as the mild-mannered night janitor. Emma Rodriguez deserved that scholarship. She deserved every opportunity that wealth and privilege had tried to deny her. And if attending this gala meant he had to temporarily shed his disguise and remind the people in that ballroom exactly who he used to be, then so be it. They'd taken his father's dignity in life, treating him as invisible until the very end. They wouldn't do the same to this brilliant young woman. Not while he had breath in his body and the power to prevent it. Marcus Allen was about to disappear for one evening, and Marcus Alexander Laurent was about to make his return in a way no one would ever forget. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp winter sunshine that made everything look sharper, more defined, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emma woke up at dawn, far too early for an evening event, but sleep had abandoned her somewhere around 3 in the morning when the anxiety had truly taken hold. She lay in her narrow dorm bed, staring at the ceiling, mentally rehearsing conversations she might have to have with donors and administrators, imagining all the ways she might embarrass herself or say the wrong thing. The scholarship depended not just on her academic record, which was impeccable, but on her performance at this gala, her ability to charm and impress the people who held her future in their wealthy, manicured hands. She spent the morning trying to distract herself with homework, but the words on the page might as well have been written in a foreign language. By noon, she gave up and began the elaborate process of getting ready. She'd watched countless tutorials on how to style hair and apply makeup for formal events. Her phone propped against her desk lamp as she tried to transform herself from exhausted scholarship student into someone who looked like she belonged in a ballroom. The emerald dress hung on the back of her closet door, and every time she looked at it, her stomach did a nervous flip. It was beautiful, far more beautiful than anything she'd ever owned. But it also felt like a costume for a role she wasn't sure she could play. While Emma was preparing, the university's grand ballroom was undergoing its own transformation. A team of event coordinators swarmed through the space, arranging elaborate floral centerpieces, testing the lighting systems, and setting tables with china and crystal that probably cost more than Emma's entire year of tuition. The Chancellor's Gala was the university's crown jewel event, the annual evening when wealthy donors were courted, major gifts were announced, and the institution's commitment to excellence was put on spectacular display. Everything had to be perfect. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, and old money families whose names adorned buildings across campus. Among the expected guests were the other 4 scholarship finalists, each of them bringing their own stories of achievement and adversity. There was James Chun, a biochemistry major whose research on cancer treatment had already attracted attention from major pharmaceutical companies. There was Keisha Williams, a first-generation student like Emma who'd started a nonprofit providing free tutoring to underserved communities. There was David Park, an engineering prodigy who'd built a prototype for low-cost water purification systems. And there was Olivia Hartwell, whose last name was already carved into the library's facade thanks to her great-grandfather's donation decades ago. The scholarship committee liked to present a diverse group of finalists, but everyone knew that Olivia was the front-runner. The safe choice, the candidate whose family's continued generosity to the university would be assured by her selection. Emma knew all of this because she'd she'd done her research. She'd learned everything she could about the other finalists, about the selection committee members, about the donors who would be in attendance. Knowledge was the only weapon she had in a fight where every other competitor seemed to have been born with advantages she could barely imagine. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her simple decision to invite Marcus as her date had already sent ripples through the university's administrative offices in ways that would only become clear as the evening unfolded. Dr. Patricia Wexler, the dean of students and head of the scholarship committee, sat in her office that afternoon reviewing the final arrangements. She was a formidable woman in her early 60s, her silver hair cut in a precise bob that matched the sharp lines of her tailored suit. She dedicated her career to higher education and took fierce pride in her role as a gatekeeper of opportunity. The Ashford Foundation Scholarship was her creation, her legacy, and she took the selection process very seriously. On her desk were 5 folders, one for each finalist. She'd reviewed them countless times, weighing academic achievements against personal narratives, calculating which student would best represent the university's values and generate the most positive publicity. Her assistant knocked and entered, carrying a clipboard with the final seating chart. Dr. Wexler, there's a small situation with the Rodriguez girls +1. The name she provided for her guest is Marcus Allen. We ran it through our database for the seating arrangements, and he's listed as custodial staff. Dr. Wexler looked up sharply. The janitor? The scholarship finalist is bringing a janitor as her date? Quote, the assistant nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. It appears so. The question is whether we should intervene. Perhaps suggest she'd bring someone more, well, appropriate. Dr. Wexler leaned back in her chair, her mind already calculating the optics. This was precisely the kind of situation that could either be wonderfully authentic, a touching display of a student's lack of pretension and connection to the working class roots the university claimed to value, or it could be embarrassingly awkward, a reminder of class divisions that donors preferred to ignore while sipping champagne. Leave it, she finally said. If the girl wants to bring the janitor letter, it might actually work in her favor with some of the more progressive donors. Shows she's genuine, unpretentious, and if it backfires, well, that tells us something about her judgment. The assistant made a note and left, but Dr. Wexler continued to stare at Emma's folder. There was something about this particular candidate that made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite articulate what it was. Emma Rodriguez was perhaps too perfect on paper, too sympathetic, too much of an underdog story. And in Dr. Wexler's experience, when something seemed too good to be true in academia, it usually was. Back in her dorm room, Emma was putting the final touches on her appearance. She'd managed to tame her dark hair into soft waves that cascaded over one shoulder. Her makeup was subtle but effective, emphasizing her warm brown eyes and high cheekbones. The emerald dress fit her like it had been made for her body, the repaired hem invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. She slipped on the one pair of heels she owned, simple black pumps she'd bought at a discount store for job interviews, and stood in front of her full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, someone elegant and confident, someone who looked like they belonged in the world she was about to enter. It was both thrilling and terrifying. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother back in Texas. Misha, thinking of you today. You make us so proud. No matter what happens, you are already a winner. The message made Emma's eyes sting with tears. She couldn't afford to cry without ruining her makeup. Her family had sacrificed so much to help her get to this point, working extra shifts and going without so she could pursue an education they'd never had the opportunity to experience themselves. The scholarship wasn't just about her future. It was about honoring their sacrifice, about proving that their belief in her hadn't been misplaced. She grabbed her small clutch purse, the one she'd borrowed from a girl down the hall, and took one last look around her cramped dorm room. The space was tiny and shabby, with water-stained ceiling tiles and a radiator that clanged and hissed through the night, but it was hers, earned through her own hard work and determination. In a few hours, she would know if that hard work had been enough. If a girl from a small Texas town with more ambition than money could actually win a prize that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out the door, ready to face whatever the evening would bring. At 5:30, Emma made her way across campus toward the Humanities building. The sun was beginning to set, painting the old brick buildings in shades of gold and amber. Students were scattered across the quad, most of them in casual clothes, laughing and talking about weekend plans that had nothing to do with formal galas and life-changing scholarships. Emma felt like she was walking through 2 different worlds simultaneously. One foot in the reality of being a struggling college student and one foot in the fantasy of the evening ahead. The Humanities building loomed before her, its classical architecture a monument to learning and tradition. She could see the grand ballroom's windows already glowing with warm light, and the parking lot was filling with expensive cars, sleek sedans, and luxury vehicles that cost more than her family's house. She stood near the building's main entrance, her heart hammering against her rib, checking her phone obsessively. 5:45, 5:50, 5:50. What if Marcus didn't come? What if he'd realized how absurd this whole situation was and decided to back out? What if she'd misunderstood and he'd never actually agreed to this? The panic was rising in her throat like bile when she heard footsteps behind her, the confident stride of someone approaching with purpose. She turned around and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The man walking toward her was Marcus, and yet he wasn't Marcus at all. He was wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than her car, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that caught the fading sunlight. His shirt was crisp white, his tie a deep burgundy that complemented her green dress in a way that couldn't have been coincidental. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, but more than the clothes, it was the way he carried himself. Gone was the humble, slightly stooped posture of the night janitor. This man walked with his shoulders back, his chin up, with the easy confidence of someone who'd attended 1,000 events like this and owned every room. He'd shaved the beard, revealing a strong jawline, and removed the glasses. And the face underneath was younger than she'd realized, maybe only in his early 30s. He was, Emma realized with a shock that made her breath catch, absolutely striking. "Good evening, Emma," he said, and even his voice sounded different, richer, with an authority that hadn't been there before. His eyes met hers, and she saw something in them she'd never noticed. An intelligence so sharp and focused it was almost intimidating. "You look beautiful." She couldn't speak. She could only stare at this transformation, at this man who she'd thought she knew, but who was clearly someone else entirely. Marcus smiled, a slow, knowing smile that suggested he understood exactly what she was thinking. "Shall we?" he asked, offering her his arm. "The gala is about to begin, and I believe you have a scholarship to win." Emma took Marcus's offered arm in a daze, her fingers resting lightly on the fine fabric of his suit jacket. The material felt expensive, impossibly soft, nothing like the rough cotton of his work uniform. They walked together toward the ballroom entrance, where a young woman with a tablet was checking names against a guest list. Emma gave her name, her voice somehow steady despite the chaos of questions swirling in her mind. Who was this man beside her? How did a night janitor afford a suit like this? Why did he suddenly look like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread for luxury menswear? And most confusing of all, why did he seem so completely at ease? As if attending glittering university galas was something he did every weekend. The ballroom took her breath away. The space had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, with thousands of tiny white lights strung across the ceiling, creating the illusion of stars. The chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over everything, making the already beautiful space feel almost magical. Round tables draped in cream linens filled the room, each one set with more silverware than Emma had ever seen in one place. A string quartet played softly in one corner, the music elegant and understated, and everywhere she looked, there were people who radiated wealth and power. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns that probably cost more than a semester's tuition, all of them moving through the space with the casual confidence of those who belong. Emma felt her courage begin to falter. This was a mistake. She didn't belong here. These people would see right through her, recognize her as the scholarship kid playing dress-up in a borrowed world. But then Marcus's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a gentle, steadying pressure. "Breathe," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "You belong here more than most of them. You earned your place. They just inherited theirs." The words were so unexpected, so contrary to the humble janitor persona she knew, that Emma looked up at him sharply. Marcus met her gaze, and she saw something fierce in his eyes, a protective intensity that made her feel both safer and more confused. They were approached by a server carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Marcus took two, handing one to Emma with the natural ease of someone accustomed to such service. She noticed how the server's eyes lingered on him for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a flicker of recognition or confusion crossing his face before he moved on. They stood together at the edge of the room, Emma clutching her champagne like a lifeline, watching the crowd. She spotted the other scholarship finalists scattered throughout the ballroom. James Chun was talking animatedly with someone she recognized as a chemistry professor. Keisha Williams stood with her family, all of them dressed beautifully, her mother dabbing at tears of pride. David Park was examining one of the ice sculptures with the analytical focus of an engineer, and Olivia Hartwell, tall and blonde and radiating privilege, was holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by people who hung on her every word. "Emma Rodriguez?" The voice came from behind them, polished and professional. Emma turned to find Dr. Patricia Wexler approaching, her silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers, her expression pleasantly neutral. "I'm Dr. Wexler, Dean of Students and Chair of the Scholarship Committee. I wanted to personally welcome you to the gala." "Thank you, Dr. Wexler," Emma said, grateful that her voice didn't shake. "I'm honored to be here." The dean's eyes shifted to Marcus, and Emma saw her do a quick assessment, the kind of subtle once-over that took in every detail of his appearance. "And you are?" "Marcus Allen," he said smoothly, extending his hand. "A friend of Emma's." "Doctor." Wexler shook his hand, and Emma noticed the brief flash of surprise on her face. "You look familiar, Mr. Allen. Have we met before?" Marcus's expression didn't change, but Emma felt a subtle tension in the arm she was holding. "I have one of those faces," he said with an easy smile. "I get that a lot." The dean looked like she wanted to pursue the question further, but a donor called her name from across the room, and she excused herself with a professional smile. Emma waited until she was out of earshot before turning to Marcus. "Okay," she said, keeping her voice low. "Who are you, really? Because you're not just a janitor, are you?" Marcus took a slow sip of his champagne, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone mapping terrain. "That's a complicated question, Emma, but I promise you by the end of this evening, you'll know everything. Right now, though, I need you to focus on why you're here. You have 5 tables of donors to charm, a scholarship committee to impress, and a future to secure." His deflection was masterful, leaving her with more questions than answers, but also with a clear directive that she couldn't argue with. He was right. Whatever secrets he was hiding, they would have to wait. Tonight was about the scholarship, about everything she'd worked for. The dinner began, and Emma found herself seated at a table with 2 board members, a tech entrepreneur who donated millions to the business school, and Olivia Hartwell. Marcus sat beside her, his presence a steady anchor as course after course appeared before them. The conversation was exactly as challenging as she'd feared, full of subtle tests disguised as small talk. Where was she from? What did her parents do? What were her plans after graduation? Emma answered each question carefully, aware that she was being evaluated, that every word mattered. She talked about her hometown in Texas, her parents who worked in a processing plant, her dream of becoming a civil rights attorney. She was honest about her background while also making it clear that she understood the language of this world, that she could navigate their spaces and speak their vocabulary when necessary. But it was Marcus who truly surprised her. He engaged in the conversation with an ease and knowledge that seemed impossible for a custodian. When the tech entrepreneur mentioned a recent market disruption, Marcus offered insights about economic policy that had the man leaning forward with interest. When one of the board members complained about government regulation, Marcus calmly presented a counter-argument about market failures and the social cost of unfettered capitalism that was so articulate and well-reasoned that the table fell silent. Emma stared at him, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. This wasn't lucky knowledge. This was expertise, the kind that came from years of study and deep understanding. Who was this man? Olivia Hartwell had noticed too. She studied Marcus with narrowed eyes, her polished smile never faltering but her gaze calculating. "You seem very well informed about economic policy, Mr. Allen," she said, her tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious for someone in his position. "What do you do for work?" Marcus met her eyes levelly, and Emma saw something flash between them, a silent challenge. "I work at the university," he said simply, "in maintenance." The answer was technically true, but deliberately evasive, and Emma could see Olivia trying to reconcile the eloquent man at the table with the janitor's uniform he'd implied. Before she could press further, Dr. Wexler stood at the podium at the front of the room, tapping a microphone to get everyone's attention. The announcement was coming. Emma's heart began to race. This was it. This was the moment that would determine whether the last 4 years of sacrificing sleep and social life and any semblance of balance had been worth it. Dr. Wexler gave a long speech about the university's commitment to excellence and opportunity, about how the Ashford Foundation Scholarship represented the institution's values. She talked about the rigorous selection process, the exceptional quality of this year's finalists, the difficult decision the committee had faced. Every word felt like a knife's edge, sharp and dangerous, capable of cutting through Emma's carefully constructed hope. She felt Marcus's hand find hers under the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of support that felt both comforting and electric. She held on tightly, needing that anchor. "And now," Dr. Wexler said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "I'm pleased to announce that this year's recipient of the Ashford Foundation Scholarship, a full 4-year award covering tuition, room, board, and a stipend for research and professional development, goes to Miss Olivia Hartwell." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Emma felt her world collapse. She'd known it was a possibility. She'd tried to prepare herself for this outcome, but knowing and experiencing were 2 entirely different things. Her vision blurred, her chest felt tight, she couldn't breathe. Around her, people were standing, clapping, celebrating Olivia as she made her way to the podium with the practiced grace of someone who'd always known she would win. Emma wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and never have to face anyone again, but Marcus didn't let go of her hand. He held on firmly, grounding her, and when she finally managed to look at him through her tears, his expression was calm, almost peaceful. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise of the applause. "Trust me." Before she could ask what he meant, he was standing, helping her to her feet with gentle insistence. "Come with me," he said. "There's something I need to show you." Emma followed him in a daze as he led her away from their table, away from the celebration, toward the back of the ballroom where a hallway led to the administrative offices. Her mind was numb with disappointment. She barely registered where they were going until Marcus stopped in front of a heavy wooden door with a brass nameplate that read Chancellor's Office. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and gestured for her to enter. The office was dark, illuminated only by the city lights filtering through the large windows. It was an impressive space, all mahogany and leather and the trappings of institutional power. Emma turned to Marcus, confusion cutting through her grief. "Why are we here?" What are you showing me? Marcus walked to the large desk that dominated the room, flipped on a small lamp. In its warm glow, Emma could see the walls covered with photographs, the chancellor shaking hands with presidents and dignitaries, receiving awards, cutting ribbons. But Marcus wasn't looking at those. He was looking at a set of older photographs, partially hidden behind newer ones, images from the university's academic past. He pointed to one particular photo, a faculty group shot from 3 years ago. Emma stepped closer, squinting in the dim light, and then she saw him. Standing in the back row, younger and clean-shaven, wearing academic regalia, was Marcus. But the nameplate beneath the photo didn't say Marcus Allen. It said Professor Marcus Alexander Laurent, Department of Economics, recipient of the Distinguished Scholar Award. Emma's world tilted for the second time that evening, but for an entirely different reason. Emma felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She stared at the photograph, then at Marcus, then back at the photograph, her mind struggling to reconcile the two versions of the same man, Professor Marcus Alexander Laurent. The name echoed in her head, and suddenly fragments of memory began clicking into place. She had heard that name before, not from Marcus, but from her economics professor who'd mentioned him in passing, referring to his groundbreaking research on wealth inequality, calling him one of the brightest minds in the field before he'd mysteriously vanished from academia. That Marcus, the celebrated economist, the youngest tenured professor in the university's history, that Marcus was standing in front of her, had been mopping floors beside her for 2 years, had been her friend while living under a disguise so complete she'd never suspected anything. "You're him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're Professor Laurent. All this time you were him, and you let me think you were just a janitor." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with a hurt she couldn't quite name. Marcus's expression softened with something that looked like regret. "I was a professor," he said quietly, past tense. "That life ended 3 years ago. I walked away from it, Emma. I chose to be who I am now." "But you're not a janitor," she said, her voice rising with a confusing mix of anger and betrayal. "You're one of the most brilliant economists in the country. You were famous. You had everything, and you just threw it away to mop floors? Why? Why would anyone do that?" Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the campus below, at the glittering lights of the Gala visible through the ballroom's tall windows. "Because none of it mattered," he said, his voice heavy with a pain she was only beginning to understand. "The publications, the accolades, the speaking engagements, the 6-figure salary. I was successful by every metric the world uses to measure worth, and I was miserable. I'd become everything I never wanted to be, surrounded by people who measured human value in dollars and academic credentials, who looked down on the very people I'd spent my career trying to help." He turned back to face her, and in the dim light she could see the weight of his choices etched in the lines around his eyes. "My father was a custodian. He worked nights his entire life, cleaning buildings while everyone else slept, and when he died, no one came to his funeral except me and my mother. The university he'd worked at for 20 years didn't even send flowers. He was invisible to them, disposable, less than human, and I realized that by climbing the ladder of success, I'd become one of them. I was looking down from the top at people like my father, people like you, and calling it compassion from a safe distance." Emma felt her anger begin to dissolve, replaced by a deep, aching understanding. "So you walked away," she said softly. "You gave it all up to become what your father was, to honor him." Marcus nodded. "And to save myself. I was drowning in that world, Emma. Every donor dinner, every faculty meeting, every time I had to smile and pretend that wealth was the same thing as wisdom, I lost a piece of who I was. The custodial work gave me back something I'd lost. Dignity, purpose, the ability to help people, without expecting anything in return, without turning human connection into another line on my curriculum vitae." Emma walked closer to him, seeing him fully for the first time, not as the humble janitor who'd been her quiet friend, and not as the celebrated professor in the photograph, but as something in between, a man trying to navigate between two worlds and finding peace in neither. "But why not tell me?" she asked. "Why keep it secret?" "Because the moment people know who I used to be, everything changes," Marcus said, his voice tinged with sadness. "They stop seeing me as I am and start seeing me as what I was. They want explanations and justification. They want to fix me, to convince me to come back, to tell me I'm wasting my potential." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "You were the first person in 3 years who saw me for who I actually am, not who I used to be or who I'm supposed to be. You saw Marcus Allen, the janitor who played games with you in hallways and listened when you needed someone. That person is more real than Professor Laurent ever was." Emma felt tears streaming down her face, and she didn't try to stop them. "I still don't understand why we're here," she said, gesturing at the chancellor's office. "I just lost the scholarship. It's over. Olivia won." Marcus shook his head slowly. "He didn't lose anything. The game was rigged from the start." He walked back to the desk and picked up a folder that had been sitting there, partially hidden under other documents. Emma recognized it immediately. It was hers. The scholarship application file with her name emblazoned on the tab. Marcus opened it, revealing page after page of her transcripts, her essays, her letters of recommendation. Every metric that mattered showed she was the strongest candidate by a significant margin. Her GPA was perfect. Her test scores were in the top percentile. Her extracurricular activities demonstrated both leadership and genuine commitment to service. She had everything the scholarship supposedly valued. Everything except one thing: a last name that already appeared on campus buildings and a family capable of making significant donations. "Look at this," Marcus said, pulling out a separate document that had been paperclipped to her file. It was an email chain, and even from a distance, Emma could see Dr. Wexler's name at the top. Marcus handed it to her, and she began to read, her stomach turning with each line. The emails were between Dr. Wexler and the chair of the board of trustees, and they were dated from 2 weeks ago, before the gala had even been scheduled. The conversation was cordial and professional, but the content was damning. Dr. Wexler had written about the importance of maintaining relationships with major donor families, about how the Hartwells had been generous supporters for 3 generations, about how Olivia's selection would ensure continued funding for several key programs. The scholarship, which was supposed to be merit-based, had been decided before the finalists had even walked into the ballroom. The gala wasn't a competition, it was theater, a performance designed to make the predetermined outcome look legitimate. Emma felt sick. All the preparation, all the hope, all the anxiety about impressing donors and saying the right things had been for nothing. She'd been invited to play a role in someone else's story. The poor girl who'd tried her best but just couldn't quite measure up to the deserving winner from the right family. It was cruel, it was corrupt, and apparently it was standard practice. "How did you know about this?" she asked, her voice hollow. "How did you get access to these files?" Marcus's expression was grim. "Because 3 years ago I sat in meetings where these exact conversations happened. I watched scholarship decisions get made based on donor relations instead of merit. I watched brilliant students like you get passed over in favor of mediocre ones with the right connections. It's one of the reasons I left. I couldn't be complicit anymore." He'd come prepared tonight, knowing what was going to happen, knowing Emma would be devastated, and he'd brought her here to show her the truth, not to comfort her with lies, but to give her something more valuable. Evidence. Proof that her failure wasn't about her inadequacy, but about a system designed to perpetuate privilege. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Emma asked, holding up the email printouts. "If the decision is already made, what difference does knowing about it make?" Marcus took the papers from her hands and set them back on the desk. Then he pulled out his phone and took several photographs of the documents, the flash briefly illuminating the dark office. "You're going to expose it," he said simply. "You're going to show the world that this scholarship, this beacon of the university's supposed commitment to equality and opportunity, is nothing but a system for rewarding wealth and connections." Emma's eyes widened. "I can't do that. They'll destroy me. They'll make sure I never get another scholarship anywhere. I'll be blacklisted." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "Or maybe you'll start a conversation that's long overdue. Maybe other students who've been cheated will come forward. Maybe the press will pay attention. Maybe nothing will change, but at least you'll know you didn't go quietly into the role they'd assigned you." He was asking her to risk everything, to become a whistleblower against an institution that held immense power over her future. But he was also offering her agency, the power to control her own narrative instead of being a supporting character in someone else's. Emma looked down at her dress, at the careful persona she'd constructed for the evening, and felt it all fall away. She wasn't here to beg for scraps from the wealthy. She was here because she'd earned her place. And if the system was broken, if the game was rigged, then maybe it was time to stop playing by their rules. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "I need to process everything you've told me." "Of course," Marcus said gently. "I didn't bring you here to pressure you. I brought you here because you deserve to know the truth. Whatever you decide to do with it is entirely your choice." They stood together in the dark office, two people who'd both been failed by systems that claimed to reward merit but actually rewarded conformity. Emma felt something shift inside her. A transformation that had nothing to do with the dress she was wearing or the room she was standing in. She'd come to this gala hoping to win approval from people who'd never intended to give it. She'd spent the evening trying to prove she belonged in a world that had already decided she didn't. But standing here with Marcus, with the evidence of institutional corruption spread across the chancellor's desk, she realized that belonging had never been the right goal. The right goal was changing the world that had tried to exclude her. Before she could say anything else, they heard voices in the hallway, footsteps approaching. Marcus quickly turned off the desk lamp, plunging them back into darkness. They stood frozen, barely breathing, as the doorknob turned and light flooded in from the corridor. Dr. Wexler stood in the doorway, her hand still on the light switch, her eyes widening in shock as she registered their presence. "Miss Rodriguez? Mr. Allen?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. "What exactly are you doing in the Chancellor's office?" The silence that followed Dr. Wexler's question was suffocating. Emma's mind raced, scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. An invasion of the Chancellor's private office to gather evidence of corruption. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She was caught, exposed, and about to lose not just the scholarship, but possibly her place at the university entirely. But Marcus stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who'd navigated far more dangerous situations than this. His posture straightened, his shoulders squared, and when he spoke, it wasn't with the deferential tone of a custodian caught somewhere he shouldn't be. It was with the measured authority of someone who had every right to be exactly where he was. "I brought her here, Dr. Wexler," Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight that made the dean pause mid-step into the office. "I thought Miss Rodriguez deserved to see the truth about the scholarship. She'd spent 4 years working toward." Dr. Wexler's eyes narrowed, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the calculating mind underneath. "The truth? I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Allen." and I'm quite certain that neither of you has any business being in this office. Marcus reached over and flipped the desk lamp back on. The warm light illuminated the papers still spread across the Chancellor's desk, the email chains visible even from where Dr. Wexler stood. Her face went pale, then flushed with anger. She stepped fully into the office and closed the door behind her with a quiet click that sounded ominous in the tense silence. "You've broken into the Chancellor's office and gone through confidential documents," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea how serious this is? I could have you both expelled and arrested. You won't have to wait for scholarship decisions, Miss Rodriguez, because you won't be a student here anymore." The threat was real, and Emma felt her knees go weak. This was it. In trying to expose corruption, she'd just destroyed her entire future. But Marcus didn't flinch. He picked up the email printout and held it up so Dr. Wexler could see it clearly. "The door was unlocked," he said calmly. "We didn't break in. We walked into an unsecured office and found evidence that the Ashford Foundation scholarship, advertised as a merit-based award, was predetermined based on donor relations. That's fraud, Dr. Wexler. That's a violation of the scholarship's own charter and probably several state education laws, Doctor." Wexler's jaw tightened. "You're a custodian," she spat, the word dripping with contempt. "You have no authority to make accusations about university policy. You have no standing, no credibility, and no understanding of the complexities of institutional fundraising." Marcus smiled, and it was a cold, sharp expression that transformed his face into something Emma had never seen before. "Actually," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I'm Professor Marcus Alexander Laurent, or at least I was until 3 years ago when I resigned my tenured position in the economics department. I published extensively on institutional corruption and wealth inequality. My research has been cited by congressional committees and used in federal court cases about discriminatory funding practices. So when it comes to understanding the complexities of institutional fundraising, I'd say I have quite a bit of standing." The color drained from Dr. Wexler's face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She stared at Marcus as if seeing a ghost, which, in a way, she was. The legendary professor who'd vanished, who'd become an academic mystery, was standing in front of her in a designer suit, holding evidence of the exact kind of corruption he'd once written papers about. Emma watched the shift in power dynamics with a mixture of awe and terror. This was Marcus unleashed, no longer hiding behind the humble persona of the janitor, but stepping fully into the identity he'd tried to leave behind, and he was doing it for her. "Professor Laurent," Dr. Wexler finally managed, her voice shaking slightly, "I had no idea. No one knew you were working here as custodial staff. The administration would never have approved such an arrangement if they'd known who you were. Because you were afraid of exactly this," Marcus said, gesturing at the documents. "Afraid that someone who actually understood how these systems work would see through the performance and expose it." Dr. Wexler straightened, trying to regain her composure and authority. "Even if what you say is true, and I'm not admitting anything, these are private communication. You had no right to access them, and Miss Rodriguez's involvement in this break-in will be noted in her permanent record." Emma found her voice, the fear transforming into anger. "I didn't break in," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I followed my date into an unlocked office, and when I saw evidence that the scholarship I'd worked 4 years to earn had been given to someone else because of their family's money, I had every right to be upset. You made us all perform for you tonight, made us parade around and charm donors and prove we were worthy, when you'd already decided that merit didn't matter as much as maintaining relationships with wealthy families." "That's not how this works," Dr. Wexler protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "You don't understand the pressures of running a major university. We need donor support to survive, to provide scholarships like this one. Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions that balance multiple considerations. So you balance them on the backs of students like Emma," Marcus said quietly. "Students who did everything right, who followed all the rules, who believed the lie that hard work and merit would be enough. You let them hope, let them dream, let them expose their vulnerabilities and their struggles to a room full of wealthy strangers, and then you take it all away because someone else's last name is already on a building." Dr. Wexler's face hardened. "You have no proof that the decision was made inappropriately. The selection committee followed all proper procedures." Marcus pulled out his phone, the one with the photographs he'd taken of the documents. "I have several high-resolution images of emails that suggest otherwise," he said. "And I'm quite certain that if these were to be shared with, say, the student newspaper, or perhaps the local news outlets who love a good story about university corruption, they might disagree with your assessment of proper procedure." The threat hung in the air, and Emma realized what Marcus was doing. He was negotiating, using the leverage of exposure to force a different outcome. It was brilliant and terrifying, and she had no idea if it would work or if they were about to face consequences that would destroy both their future. Dr. Wexler's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tight. Marcus looked at Emma, and she saw the question in his eyes. This was her decision. He'd given her the power, but he wouldn't without her consent. Emma thought about her family back in Texas, about the years of sacrifice and struggle, about the girl she'd been when she first arrived on campus with nothing but determination and a desperate hope for something better. She thought about all the other students who'd been passed over, who'd lost opportunities to people with the right connections and the right last name, and she knew what she had to do. I want the scholarship committee to reconvene, Emma said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. I want them to review all 5 applications with the names and family backgrounds removed. Blind evaluation, purely on academic merit and personal achievement. And I want the results announced within the week, Doctor. Wexler laughed, but it was a bitter, defeated sound. That's impossible. The announcement has already been made. Olivia Hartwell is already celebrating with her family. We can't just undo that. Then you'll have to explain why, Marcus said calmly. You'll have to tell her family and all those donors in that ballroom that there was an irregularity in the selection process that requires review. You'll have to admit that maybe, just maybe, the decision wasn't as clear-cut as you claimed. Or he held up his phone. We can share these documents and let the public decide whether your procedures were appropriate. Dr. Wexler was trapped, and she knew it. Her carefully constructed world of donor management and institutional politics was crumbling, and there was no easy way out that didn't involve either admitting to corruption or risking massive public embarrassment. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the fight had gone out of her. Fine, she said, the word barely audible. I'll convene an emergency committee meeting tomorrow morning. We'll review the applications again under the conditions you specified. But if this gets out, if any of this becomes public, I will make sure you both pay for it in ways you can't imagine. Marcus pocketed his phone. If the review is fair and legitimate, there's no reason for it to become public. The truth only needs to come out if you continue to perpetuate the lie, Doctor. Wexler turned to leave, then paused at the door. Professor Laurent, she said without looking back, I remember reading your work when you were still publishing. You were supposed to change the system from within. Instead, you ran away and became a janitor. What does that say about your commitment to the principles you claim to believe in? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. It says that sometimes the system is so broken that working within it makes you complicit, he replied. It says that I chose my integrity over my career, and it says that even from outside the ivory tower, I can still help students like Emma in ways I never could as a celebrated professor playing political games at donor dinners. Doctor, Wexler left without another word, closing the door behind her with a firm click. The moment she was gone, Emma's legs gave out and she sank into one of the leather chairs, her body shaking with adrenaline and relief. Marcus knelt beside her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Are you okay? He asked softly. And just like that, he was Marcus again. Not the intimidating professor, but the kind man who'd played games with her in hallways and listened when she needed someone. Emma looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. You just sacrificed everything for me, she whispered. Your anonymity, your peace, your whole carefully constructed life. Why would you do that? Marcus smiled, and it was gentle and sad and full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. Because you reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place, he said quietly. Because watching you work yourself to exhaustion while rich kids coasted on their family names made me angry in a way I haven't felt in years. And because sometimes the right thing to do is worth any cost. Emma threw her arms around him, holding on tight, and Marcus held her back. Two people who'd found each other in the margins of an institution that had tried to make them both invisible. Now standing at the center of a fight that could change everything. They didn't return to the gala. There was no point. The champagne and celebration in the ballroom felt like it belonged to a different world. One where Emma had still believed in the fairness of systems and Marcus had still been content in his anonymity. Instead, they left through a side exit, stepping out into the cold night air that felt sharp and cleansing after the stifling atmosphere inside. Emma was still shaking, the adrenaline slowly fading and leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Marcus walked beside her in silence, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. They found themselves at a small bench overlooking the campus quad, the same one where they'd shared countless late-night conversations over the past 2 years, though those conversations had been based on an incomplete truth. Emma sat down, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. The emerald dress that had made her feel so confident hours ago now felt like a costume she couldn't wait to take off. Marcus settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, though Emma found herself wishing he wouldn't. I don't know whether to thank you or be angry with, she said finally, breaking the silence. You lied to me for 2 years. You let me think you were someone you weren't. I know, Marcus said quietly, and she could hear the genuine regret in his voice, and I'm sorry for that. But I need you to understand that Marcus Allen, the janitor, isn't a lie. He's who I actually am, stripped of all the credentials and accomplishments that the world insisted defined me. Professor Laurent was the performance, the suit, the lectures, the donor dinners. That was the role I was playing. This, he gestured at himself, at the campus around them, is the truth. Emma turned to look at him fully. The man sitting beside her was somewhere between the two versions she'd known. He'd taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, loosened his tie, and the careful polish of Professor Laurent had softened back into something more familiar. But she could see both men now, layered over each other like a double exposure photograph. So who am I talking to right now? She asked. Are you Marcus or are you Professor Laurent? I'm whoever you need me to be, he said, then shook his head. No, that's not true. I'm both. I'm neither. I'm figuring it out as I go. He looked out at the darkened campus, at the buildings where he'd once taught brilliant theories about economic justice, and where he now emptied trash cans and mopped floors. I thought I could keep those two lives separate, but tonight proved I was wrong. The moment you asked me to be your date, I knew the walls were going to come down. I just didn't know if I was ready for it. Are you ready now? Emma asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of vulnerability she'd never heard from him before. I'm terrified, he admitted. Tomorrow morning, when Dr. Wexler reconvenes that committee, word is going to spread. People are going to ask questions. The chancellor will demand an explanation for why a former tenured professor has been working as custodial staff for 3 years. My colleagues will feel betrayed or confused or angry that I left without explanation. The life I've built, the peace I found, it's all going to be ripped apart. He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the campus lamps, she could see the fear in his eyes. But watching you tonight, seeing your disappointment when they announced Olivia's name, knowing that you'd been cheated by a system that claims to reward merit, I realized something. Running away and finding peace for myself wasn't enough. It was selfish, actually. I have knowledge and privilege and access that most people don't, and I've been using it to hide instead of to help. You changed that. You reminded me that sometimes peace is a luxury we can't afford when others are still fighting. Emma felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of disappointment or fear. They were tears of recognition, of seeing someone truly bare their soul and finding it beautiful despite its flaws. I'm scared too, she whispered. What if the committee reviews the applications and still chooses Olivia? What if all of this was for nothing and I've just made enemies of powerful people who can make my life miserable? What if I don't win the scholarship and I have to drop out because I can't afford tuition? All of those possibilities are real, Marcus acknowledged. But consider this alternative. What if you'd sat in that ballroom, watched someone less qualified win because of their last name and done nothing? What if you'd gone home tonight accepting that the game was rigged and there was nothing you could do about it? Could you have lived with that? Emma thought about it, really thought about it. She imagined going back to her dorm room, packing up her meager belongings, calling her parents to tell them she'd failed. She imagined spending the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she'd been brave enough to fight back, if she'd demanded fairness even when it was dangerous to do so. And she knew the answer. No, she said firmly. I couldn't have lived with that. Then, regardless of what happens tomorrow, you've already won something more important than a scholarship, Marcus said. Proven to yourself that you won't accept injustice quietly. That's a kind of victory the scholarship committee can't give or take away. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who'd found an unexpected connection in the margins of an institution that had tried to diminish them both. Emma felt the tension slowly leaving her body, replaced by something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. Hope. Not the naive hope she'd carried into the gala, the belief that hard work would automatically be rewarded. This was a more mature hope, one tempered by the knowledge of how broken the system was, but strengthened by the realization that it could be challenged, that she didn't have to accept injustice just because it was institutional. Can I ask you something? Emma said after a while. Of course. Why didn't you just leave? If you hated being a professor so much, why stay at the same university? Why not go somewhere else entirely? Start fresh where no one knew you? Marcus smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. This is where my father worked. He was a custodian in the engineering building for 15 years. Every night when I mop those floors, I'm walking the same hallways he walked. I'm doing the work he did with dignity and pride, even when people treated him as invisible. It's my way of honoring him, of understanding what his life was like, of proving that the work he did mattered. Emma reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. He didn't pull away. Your father would be proud of you, she said softly. Not because you were a famous professor, but because you gave up everything to live according to his values. That takes more courage than any academic achievement. They stayed on that bench for another hour talking about everything and nothing. Marcus told her about his childhood, growing up in a small apartment with parents who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, about his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce determination that her son would have opportunities they never had. He told her about the guilt he'd felt climbing the academic ladder, leaving behind the community that had shaped him, becoming someone his father wouldn't have recognized. Emma told him about her own family, about parents who'd never finished high school but who believed in education with an almost religious fervor, about the pressure of being the first in her family to go to college, about the loneliness of navigating a world where everyone else seemed to have a map and she was just guessing at the directions. Their stories were different in the details but identical in the essentials. They were both people caught between worlds, trying to honor where they came from while reaching for something their families had never been able to access. When Emma finally looked at her phone, it was past midnight. The gala had ended hours ago. The campus was quiet, most students already asleep or at parties celebrating the weekend. She should have been exhausted, but instead she felt energized, alive in a way she hadn't in years. Marcus walked her back to her dorm, the two of them moving slowly through the empty pathways, neither wanting the night to end despite everything that had happened. At the entrance to her building, Emma turned to face him. What happens now? She asked. Tomorrow morning, we find out if standing up to the system actually changes anything, Marcus said, and regardless of the outcome, we deal with the consequences together. You don't have to do that, Emma protested. This is my fight. You've already done so much. It stopped being just your fight the moment I walked into that office with you, Marcus said firmly. We're in this together now. Whatever happens, whatever fallout there is, we face it as a team. Emma stepped closer, closing the distance between them. In the harsh fluorescent light of the dorm entrance, She could see every detail of his face, the tiredness around his eyes, the shadow of beard already growing back, the complex mixture of fear and determination in his expression. "Thank you," she said, but the words felt inadequate for everything he'd sacrificed for her tonight. Marcus reached up and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment. "Thank you for asking a janitor to be your date to the dance," he said with a small smile. "It was the best decision I never knew I was waiting for." They stood there for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, a connection that had been building for 2 years without either of them fully recognizing it. Then Emma did something brave. She stood on her toes and kissed him softly, a brief, gentle pressure of lips that felt like a promise and a question all at once. When she pulled back, Marcus's eyes were wide with surprise, but there was warmth there too, and something that looked like wonder. "That was probably inappropriate," Emma said, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." Marcus shook his head, a genuine smile breaking across his face, the first truly happy expression she'd seen from him all night. "Don't apologize," he said softly. "That was the most honest thing that's happened all evening." Emma felt her cheeks flush, but she returned his smile. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." "It is," Marcus agreed. "But whatever happens, remember something. You are brilliant, hardworking, and deserving of every opportunity you've fought for. A corrupt system doesn't get to define your worth, only you do." Emma nodded, committing his words to memory, letting them fill the spaces where doubt had lived for so long. She turned to go inside, then paused at the door. "Marcus?" He looked at her, his hands back in his pockets, his posture relaxed despite the chaos that awaited them both. "Will you still be my friend after all this? After everything changes?" "Always," he said without hesitation. "Professor or janitor or something in between, I'll always be your friend, and maybe, if you're interested, something more than that." Emma's heart soared. "We'll see," she said, trying to sound casual despite the joy bubbling up inside her. "Let's get through tomorrow first, then we can figure out what comes next." She went inside, and Marcus waited until he saw her light turn on in her third-floor window before he turned and walked back across campus, toward his small apartment and the uncertain future that awaited them both. Emma didn't sleep. She lay in her narrow dorm bed, watching the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening in her mind like a film stuck on repeat. The disappointment of Olivia's announcement, the shock of discovering Marcus's true identity, the terrifying confrontation in the chancellor's office, the kiss that still made her lips tingle when she thought about it. Every hour she checked her phone, half expecting a message from Dr. Wexler saying the deal was off, that she was being expelled, that security was on their way to escort her from campus. But no message came. The silence was almost worse than a threat would have been. At 6 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely. She took a long shower in the communal bathroom, letting the hot water wash away some of the tension knotted in her shoulders. When she returned to her room, she found a text from Marcus. It was simple and direct. "Committee meeting at 9. I'll be there. You're not alone." Those 3 words, "you're not alone," steadied her more than any lengthy reassurance could have. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like armor, dark jeans, a crisp white button-down shirt, her only blazer that she'd bought at a thrift store for job interviews. She pulled her hair back in a neat bun and looked at herself in the mirror. The girl looking back at her wasn't the hopeful scholarship candidate from last night. She was someone who'd seen behind the curtain, who knew how the game was played, and who decided to flip the board rather than accept the rigged outcome. Across campus, Marcus was having a similar morning, though his was complicated by something Emma didn't have to face: the resurrection of a ghost. Word had spread overnight, the way scandalous information always did in academic circles. Dr. Wexler had been forced to explain to the chancellor why an emergency scholarship committee meeting was necessary, and that explanation had included the revelation that Professor Marcus Alexander Laurent, presumed to have left academia entirely, had actually been working as a custodian in their own buildings for 3 years. By 7 in the morning, Marcus's phone was buzzing with messages from former colleagues, from department heads, from journalists who'd covered his research years ago and smelled the story. He ignored them all. The only opinion that mattered was Emma's, and the only goal that mattered was ensuring she got the fair evaluation she deserved. He dressed in his custodial uniform. It was a deliberate choice, a statement. He was going to that committee meeting not as Professor Laurent but as Marcus Allen, the janitor who'd witnessed corruption and refused to stay silent. The suit from last night hung in his closet, and looking at it made him feel like he was staring at the shed skin of a former self. He didn't want to be that person again. He didn't want to play the game by their rules, wearing their costumes, speaking their language. If they wanted to hear from him, they would hear from the person he actually was, not the ghost of who he used to be. At 8:45, Emma stood outside the administration building, her stomach a churning mess of anxiety and determination. Students walked past her on their way to Sunday brunch, laughing and carefree, oblivious to the battle being waged in the meeting rooms above. She felt ancient compared to them, aged by a single night that had forced her to confront truths about power and privilege that they might never have to face. Marcus arrived exactly at 8:50. He was in his dark blue maintenance uniform, his name embroidered on the chest pocket, and Emma had never been more grateful to see anyone in her entire life. He walked up to her with that steady, calm presence she'd come to depend on, and without a word, he took her hand. They went inside together, riding the elevator to the 3rd floor where the conference rooms were located. The building was mostly empty on a Sunday morning, the usual bustle of administrative activity reduced to an eerie quiet. They found the conference room sealed enough. Through the glass panel in the door, Emma could see Dr. Wexler sitting at the head of a long table surrounded by 4 other people she didn't recognize, but who wore the same expression of barely concealed annoyance at having their Sunday interrupted. On the table in front of them were 5 folders, the scholarship applications, arranged in a neat row. Dr. Wexler looked up as they approached, and her expression was carefully neutral. She opened the door before they could knock. "Miss Rodriguez." "Miss Allen," she said formally, "please come in." Emma's legs felt weak, but Marcus's hand in hers kept her grounded. They entered the room, and Emma was acutely aware of how out of place they looked. The committee members were all dressed in expensive casual clothes, the kind of carefully curated weekend attire that probably cost more than Emma's entire wardrobe. And then there was Marcus in his maintenance uniform, a jarring reminder of the class divisions this meeting was supposed to address. Dr. Wexler gestured to 2 empty chairs at the far end of the table. "Please sit. I've explained the situation to the committee, though I'm certain they'd like to hear your perspective as well." Emma sat down, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Marcus sat beside her, and she noticed how the committee members looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. One of them, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and tortoiseshell glasses, leaned forward. "I'm Professor Hendricks, chair of the economics department," he said, his eyes fixed on Marcus. "I have to say, Professor Laurent or Mr. Allen or whoever you are now, this entire situation is highly irregular. We're here on a Sunday morning because you've made serious accusations about the integrity of our scholarship selection process. Accusations that, if unfounded, could constitute slander and breach of confidentiality." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "The accusations aren't unfounded, and you know it," he said quietly. "The scholarship was awarded based on donor relations rather than merit. The decision was made before the gala even took place. Emma Rodriguez was the most qualified candidate by every measurable metric, and she was passed over because Olivia Hartwell's family has deeper pockets." A woman to Professor Hendricks's left, younger with sharp features and an expensive watch, spoke up. "I'm Rebecca Thornton, General Counsel for the University. Mr. Allen, you obtained confidential communications without authorization. Any evidence you claim to have would be inadmissible in any formal proceeding. It would also be illegal for you to share it publicly." Marcus pulled out his phone and set it on the table. "These photographs show email exchanges between Dr. Wexler and the board chair discussing how Olivia's selection would secure continued funding from the Hartwell family. The Ashford Foundation Scholarship Charter explicitly states that awards must be based solely on academic merit and financial need. Using donor relations as a deciding factor violates that charter. I'm happy to have these photographs reviewed by the Foundation's board, the State Education Oversight Committee, and any journalists who might be interested in how elite universities actually distribute scholarship funds." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Hendricks and Rebecca Thornton exchanged glances. Dr. Wexler sat rigid, her face a mask of controlled fury. The other 2 committee members, whom no one had bothered to introduce, looked like they wanted to be anywhere but in that room. Emma found her voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. "I'm not here to destroy anyone's career or embarrass the university," she said, looking at each committee member in turn. "I'm here because I was promised a fair evaluation and I didn't get one. All I'm asking for is what was supposed to happen from the beginning. A blind review of all 5 applications based on merit alone. No names, no family backgrounds, no consideration of who might donate more money in the future. Just the work, the achievements, the potential. Is that really too much to ask?" Professor Hendricks sighed, the sound of a man who'd been backed into a corner and knew it. "No, Miss Rodriguez, it's not too much to ask, and frankly, it's what should have happened in the first place." He turned to Dr. Wexler. "Patricia, I think we need to acknowledge that there were irregularities in the process, not because of Mamar Allen's accusations, but because we allowed external pressures to influence what should have been a purely academic decision. I move that we conduct a complete blind review of all applications to be completed today before any of us leave this room." The motion was seconded immediately by one of the unnamed committee members, and Emma felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly made her dizzy. But Rebecca Thornton wasn't finished. "Even if we agree to this review," she said, looking pointedly at Marcus, "we need to address the issue of Mr. Allen's employment status. You resigned your faculty position 3 years ago, Professor Laurent. You are currently employed as custodial staff under what appears to be a false identity. That's grounds for termination and potentially legal action." Marcus nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. "My name is legally Marcus Allen," he said. "Marcus is my middle name and Allen is my mother's maiden name. I didn't use a false identity. I simply chose not to advertise my previous academic credentials when I applied for a custodial position. As for termination, you're welcome to fire me. But I think we both know that firing a whistleblower who exposed scholarship fraud would look worse for the university than having a former professor working in maintenance." Rebecca Thornton's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The power had shifted and everyone in the room could feel it. Marcus had played his hand perfectly, using the threat of exposure not for personal gain but to force the system to follow its own stated principles. Professor Hendricks cleared his throat. "I propose we table any employment decisions until after we've completed the scholarship review," he said. "Right now our priority should be ensuring that we select the most deserving candidate. All in favor?" Every hand went up, including, reluctantly, Dr. Wexler's. Emma felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't over yet. They still had to actually conduct the review, and there was no guarantee of the outcome. But for the first time since the gala began, she felt like she had a real chance. Not a performance, not a predetermined outcome disguised as a competition, but an actual fair evaluation of her work. Dr. Wexler stood up, her movements stiff with barely concealed anger. "Miss Rodriguez, Mr. Allen, you'll need to wait outside while we conduct the review. This is a closed committee process." "How long will it take?" Emma asked. "As long as it takes to do it properly," Professor Hendricks said, but his expression was kind. "We'll call you back in when we've reached a decision." Emma and Marcus stood and walked to the door. Just as they were leaving, Dr. Wexler spoke again. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, her voice softer than it had been all morning, "for what it's worth, your application was exceptional. In a fair world, you would have won on merit alone." Emma turned back, surprised. "Then why didn't I?" she asked simply. Dr. Wexler looked down at the table, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. "Because we don't live in a fair world," she said quietly. "We live in one where universities need money to survive, and sometimes we make compromises that we tell ourselves are for the greater good. I'm sorry." It wasn't the full apology Emma deserved, but it was something. An acknowledgement, however small, that the system was broken and that real harm had been done. Emma nodded once and left the room, Marcus following close behind. The hallway outside the conference room felt like purgatory. Emma and Marcus sat on an uncomfortable bench, the kind designed more for aesthetics than actual human use, and waited. Time moved strangely, stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to tell if 5 minutes or 5 hours had passed. Emma watched the second hand on the wall clock tick forward with agonizing slowness. Inside that room, 5 people were deciding her future, and there was nothing she could do but sit and wait and try not to let the anxiety consume her completely. Marcus seemed calmer, but Emma was learning to read the subtle tells beneath his composed exterior. His jaw was tight. His fingers drummed an unconscious rhythm against his thigh. His eyes kept drifting to the conference room door as if he could see through the wood and glass to the deliberations happening on the other side. After 20 minutes of silence, Emma couldn't take it anymore. "What if they still choose Olivia?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if even with a blind review they find some way to justify the original decision?" "Then we know we did everything we could," Marcus said, but she could hear the tension in his voice. "And we take the evidence to the foundation board and the press, and we make enough noise that this never happens to another student." "It won't help me though," Emma said, and she hated how defeated she sounded. "I'll still have to drop out. I'll still have lost." Marcus turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "You haven't lost anything. You came to this university with nothing but determination and brilliance. You've maintained a perfect academic record while working 3 jobs. You've proven yourself in every possible way. A corrupt scholarship system doesn't diminish any of that. Your worth isn't determined by their decision." "But I need the money, Marcus," Emma said, her voice cracking. "I can't stay here without it. My family can't afford to help. I've already maxed out my student loan. Without this scholarship, it's over." "I know," he said gently, "and we'll figure it out. There are other scholarships, other funding sources. I have connections from my previous life, people who would be interested in supporting someone with your potential. You're not going to drop out. I won't let that happen." Emma wanted to believe him, but the practical reality of her situation was crushing. Other scholarships took time to apply for, and she needed money now. The spring semester started in 6 weeks, and she was already behind on payments. Even if Marcus could help her find alternative funding, it felt like charity, like being rescued, and she'd spent her whole life fighting to stand on her own 2 feet. "I don't want to be anyone's charity case," she said quietly. "I wanted to win this on my own merit." "You did win it on your own merit," Marcus insisted. "What's happening in that room right now is just the system catching up to what you already proved." Emma leaned her head against the cold wall, exhaustion finally catching up with her after the sleepless night. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you stay so calm when everything is falling apart?" "I'm not calm," Marcus admitted. "I'm terrified, but I learned a long time ago that falling apart doesn't change the outcome. All it does is rob you of the strength you need to face whatever comes next." They sat in silence again, but this time it felt less oppressive. They weren't alone in this. Whatever happened, they would face it together, and that knowledge was a kind of strength Emma had never experienced before. She'd spent her entire college career feeling isolated, like she was fighting battles no one else could see or understand. But Marcus understood. He'd fought his own wars against these same systems, and he'd chosen to stand beside her even when it cost him everything he'd built. The door to the conference room opened abruptly, and a young administrative assistant Emma didn't recognize stepped out. She walked briskly down the hall without acknowledging them, carrying a folder that probably contained one of the scholarship applications. Emma's heart jumped into her throat. "What does that mean?" she whispered to Marcus. "Are they eliminating candidates? Gathering more information?" Marcus shook his head. I don't know. We just have to trust the process. Trust the process. It sounded so simple, so reasonable, but Emma had just learned exactly how broken the process was. How could she trust a system that had been designed to benefit people like Olivia Hartwell while keeping people like her on the outside looking in? Inside the conference room, the deliberation was more intense than Emma could have imagined. Professor Hendricks had insisted on a methodical approach, reviewing each application in numerical order without any identifying information. The folders had been relabeled with random numbers, and Dr. Wexler had been tasked with reading the applications aloud, stripping away any details that might reveal the applicant's identity. It was a painstaking process, and as the hours wore on, the committee members' initial annoyance had transformed into something more uncomfortable. The growing realization that their original decision had been indefensible. Application 3, Dr. Wexler read, and everyone in the room knew this was Emma's file, even though the name had been removed. GPA 4.0, perfect scores on standardized tests. Research thesis on civil rights law received highest honors. Works 25 hours per week in campus library, 10 hours per week tutoring, and 15 hours in community service. First-generation college student. Financial need assessment shows family contribution of $0. 3 exceptional letters of recommendation, including one from Professor Chun calling this the most talented student he's encountered in 20 years of teaching. Rebecca Thornton, who'd been resistant to the whole process, set down her pen with a heavy sigh. "I'm going to say something that might get me fired," she announced to the room, "but we all know that application 3 is Miss Rodriguez. And we all know that she's clearly the strongest candidate. Her academic achievements are superior to all the other finalists by a significant margin." She cleared her throat, looking uncomfortable. "I reviewed the original scoring rubric from our first evaluation. We gave her lower marks for leadership potential and community impact, citing concerns about her ability to engage with donors and represent the university. But those concerns weren't based on her actual achievement. They were based on assumptions about her background." Professor Hendricks nodded slowly. "You're saying we penalized her for being poor?" Rebecca met his eyes. "Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying. We looked at Olivia Hartwell's extensive volunteer work and called it leadership. We looked at Emma Rodriguez's paid work and survival and called it a limitation. We judged them by completely different standards." One of the unnamed committee members, a biology professor named Dr. Yates, spoke up for the first time. "I've taught both of these young women," she said quietly. "Olivia is a perfectly competent student. She's pleasant, she turns in her work on time, she participates in class discussions. But Emma's extraordinary. She asks questions that challenge my own understanding of the material. She sees connections between concepts that even graduate students miss. If we're actually evaluating merit, there is no competition here." The room fell silent as the truth settled over them like a heavy blanket. They'd all known on some level that the original decision had been wrong, but naming it explicitly, acknowledging that they'd let wealth and donor relations corrupt what should have been a pure academic evaluation, was painful in a way none of them had expected. Dr. Wexler spoke, her voice heavy with resignation. "I move that we award the Ashford Foundation Scholarship to the candidate identified as Application 3, Emma Rodriguez." The motion was seconded immediately, and the vote was unanimous. As the committee members gathered their materials and prepared to deliver the news, Professor Hendricks paused at the door. "We're going to have to explain this to the Hartwells," he said to Dr. Wexler. "They're going to be furious. Their daughter was publicly announced as the winner." "Let them be furious, Doctor," Wexler said, and there was a note of defiance in her voice that surprised everyone, including herself. Sometimes doing the right thing makes powerful people angry. "We'll survive." Outside in the hallway, Emma had stood up to pace, unable to sit still any longer. The waiting was unbearable, worse than any exam she'd ever taken, worse than any rejection she'd ever faced. At least with those, there was eventually an endpoint, a moment when the uncertainty resolved into concrete reality. This felt like it could stretch on forever, like she might spend the rest of her life in this liminal space between hope and despair. The conference room door opened and Professor Hendricks stepped out. Emma's heart stopped. His expression was neutral, carefully controlled, giving nothing away. "Miss Rodriguez, Miss Allen, would you please come back inside?" Emma's legs felt like they were made of water, but somehow she managed to walk. Marcus was beside her, his hand at the small of her back, steadying her. They entered the room, and Emma forced herself to look at the committee members' faces, trying to read their decision in their expressions. Professor Hendricks gestured to the chairs they'd occupied earlier. "Please, sit down." Emma sat, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white. Marcus sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. Professor Hendricks cleared his throat, and Emma braced herself for disappointment, for the carefully worded explanation of why they'd ultimately decided to uphold the original selection, for the crushing weight of another door closing in her face. "Miss Rodriguez," he began, and then paused. "What happened here yesterday at the gala was wrong. It was a failure of our principles, our integrity, and our responsibility to our students. We allowed external pressures to compromise what should have been an objective academic evaluation." He looked directly at her, and she saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "After conducting a thorough blind review of all 5 applications, this committee has reached a unanimous decision." Emma couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt around her, sounds fading to a distant buzz. She felt Marcus's hand find hers under the table, grounding her. "The Ashford Foundation Scholarship is awarded to you, Miss Rodriguez. Professor Hendricks said, his voice firm and clear. Your application demonstrated exceptional academic achievement, genuine financial need, and a commitment to service that embodies the values this scholarship was created to support. You are, without question, the most deserving candidate. Emma didn't move. She couldn't process what she'd just heard. The words seemed impossible, too good to be true, like if she reacted they might dissolve like smoke. Congratulations, Doctor, Wexler said softly, and there was genuine warmth in her expression. I'm sorry for what you had to endure to get here, but I hope you know that you earned this. You earned every bit of it. That's when Emma broke. The tears she'd been holding back since the gala, through the confrontation and the sleepless night and the agonizing wait, finally spilled over. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, her whole body shaking with the release of tension and fear and overwhelming relief. Marcus wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, and she leaned into him, letting herself be vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed. The committee members looked away politely, giving her a moment to compose herself. When Emma finally looked up, her face wet with tears but her eyes clear, she found her voice. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Thank you for doing the right thing. It shouldn't have taken what it took, but thank you." Professor Hendricks nodded. "You've taught us an important lesson, Miss Rodriguez. Sometimes the people who challenge the system are the ones who remind us why we built it in the first place." As they left the conference room, Emma felt like she was floating. The hallway looked different, brighter somehow, as if the very air had changed its composition. She had won, not just the scholarship, but something more valuable. Proof that standing up to injustice could actually matter, that the system could be forced to correct itself when its corruption was dragged into the light. Marcus walked beside her, and when they reached the elevator, away from any watching eyes, she turned and threw her arms around him. "I won," she whispered into his shoulder. "We won." "We did," Marcus agreed, holding her tight. "And you never have to wonder if you deserved it, because you proved it beyond any doubt." The news spread across campus like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew that the scholarship decision had been reversed, that the custodian who'd attended the gala had turned out to be a legendary former professor, and that Emma Rodriguez had challenged the university's power structure and won. The reactions were mixed. Some students celebrated, seeing it as a victory for fairness and merit over privilege. Others, particularly those from wealthy families who'd never questioned their advantages, were uncomfortable with the precedent it set, and the Hartwell family was, as predicted, furious. Olivia herself sent Emma a scathing email accusing her of ruining her reputation and using underhanded tactics to steal what was rightfully hers. Emma deleted it without responding. She had no interest in engaging with someone who genuinely believed that a scholarship she hadn't earned was rightfully hers. The university administration was in damage control mode. The chancellor had called an emergency meeting with the board of trustees to explain how a former tenured professor had been working as a janitor for 3 years without anyone noticing. There were whispers of policy changes, new oversight committees, revised scholarship evaluation, but Emma knew that real change was slow and institutional memory was short. In a year or two, the systems would likely revert to their comfortable patterns unless someone was vigilant about holding them accountable. For now, though, she'd won her battle, and that had to be enough. Marcus faced his own reckoning. His revelation had triggered a cascade of questions from university officials, from former colleagues, from journalists who saw a compelling human interest story in the brilliant professor who'd walked away from success to mop floors. He granted exactly one interview to a reporter from the campus newspaper, and he used it to talk not about himself, but about the systemic issues that affected students like Emma. He talked about how universities had become businesses more concerned with donor relations than educational mission, how wealth had become confused with merit, how the people who kept campuses running, the custodians and cafeteria workers and maintenance staff, were treated as invisible. The article went viral, picked up by national news outlets, and suddenly Marcus Allen was no longer anonymous. For better or worse, his quiet life was over. The university offered him his professorship back. It was presented as a magnanimous gesture, a chance to return to his rightful place in the academic hierarchy. Marcus turned it down. He did, however, accept a compromise, a newly created position as a lecturer in the economics department, teaching 2 courses per semester while maintaining his custodial work the rest of the time. It was unconventional, but the university was desperate to avoid the appearance of having wasted one of its most talented faculty members. Marcus agreed because it gave him the best of both worlds. He could teach, could share his knowledge with students who needed it, while also maintaining the work that connected him to his father's legacy. He would never again be just Professor Laurent, existing only in the rarefied air of academic achievement. He would be Marcus Allen, a man who understood the value of all work, regardless of how the world chose to measure it. Emma and Marcus's relationship evolved slowly, carefully, like 2 people who'd already been through so much and understood that what they had was too valuable to rush. They continued their late-night conversations, but now they were honest about everything, no more secrets or half-truths. Marcus told her about the loneliness of his previous life, the way success had isolated him from genuine human connection. Emma told him about her fears of never being good enough, of always feeling like an imposter in spaces designed for people with more privilege. They learned each other's stories completely, and in that sharing, they built something solid and real. Their first official date was at a small diner off campus, The kind of place where the coffee was terrible and the vinyl booths were cracked with age. Perfect. They sat across from each other, not as a scholarship candidate and her surprise champion, but as two people who'd seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen to stay. Marcus made her laugh with stories about the strange things people left behind in campus building. Emma made him think with her questions about economic policy and social justice. When he walked her home that night, the kiss they shared was different from the impulsive one outside her dorm. This one was deliberate, full of promise, a beginning rather than a question. The spring semester started and Emma dove into her classes with a freedom she'd never experienced before. The scholarship covered everything, truly everything. She didn't have to work 3 jobs. She could focus entirely on her education, could participate in research projects, could actually sleep for more than 4 hours a night. It was transformative. Her professors noticed the change immediately. Without the crushing weight of financial anxiety, her already considerable intellect had room to expand. She excelled in ways that surprised even her, publishing a paper on civil rights law that caught the attention of scholars in the field. The opportunities she'd fought so hard for were finally materializing, and she met each one with a fierce determination to prove she belonged. But she didn't forget where she came from. Emma started a student advocacy group focused on transparency in scholarship allocation and financial aid. She pushed for policy changes that would prevent other students from facing the kind of corruption she'd encountered. She became a voice for first-generation students, for those who worked their way through college, for everyone who'd been told they didn't quite fit. Some administrators found her annoying, this scholarship student who wouldn't just accept her good fortune quietly and move on, but others recognized that she was exactly what the university needed, someone willing to challenge comfortable assumptions and demand better. Marcus's courses became some of the most sought after on campus. He taught economics not as an abstract theoretical exercise, but as a tool for understanding and changing real-world inequality. His classroom was a mix of traditional students and ones who, like Emma, were fighting for every opportunity. He treated them all with the same respect he'd learned during his years in Maine, never forgetting that credentials and achievements didn't determine human worth. His former colleagues were puzzled by his teaching style, by his insistence on connecting economic theory to the lived experiences of working people, but his students understood. They saw a professor who genuinely cared about them as human beings, not just as numbers in his gradebook or potential publications. 6 months after the gala, Emma and Marcus attended another formal university event together, this time a recognition ceremony for outstanding students. Emma was being honored for her research, and Marcus sat in the audience wearing the same suit he'd worn that fateful night. But this time there were no secrets between them, no hidden identities, no elaborate games. They were simply two people who'd found each other in the most unexpected circumstances and built something real from the wreckage of systems that had tried to diminish them both. When Emma gave her acceptance speech, she didn't just thank her professors and her family. She thanked the custodial staff, naming Marcus specifically, acknowledging that some of the most important lessons she'd learned at the university had come from someone the institution had tried to make invisible. Later, as they walked across the quad under a canopy of stars, Emma took Marcus's hand and thought about how different her life looked now compared to that terrifying moment when she'd asked a janitor to be her date to a dance. She'd been desperate then, out of options, making what felt like a humiliating last resort. But that decision had changed everything. It had revealed corruption, forced a reckoning, and given her both a scholarship and a partner who understood her in ways she'd never expected. "You know what's funny?" she said, leaning against Marcus's shoulder. "Everyone thinks you saved me that night, but I think maybe I saved you too." Marcus smiled, the gesture soft and genuine in the dim light. "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "You reminded me why the fight matters. I reminded you that you were strong enough to win it." They stood together in the quiet campus night, two people who'd started in vastly different places, but found common ground in their refusal to accept injustice. The university continued around them, flawed and complicated, full of students who would face their own battles with systems designed to exclude them. But Emma and Marcus had proven something important, that those systems could be challenged, that courage and truth could still matter, that sometimes asking the right person to a dance could change everything. And that was worth every risk they'd taken. Every comfortable fiction they'd shattered, every door they'd forced open for those who would come after them. The story wasn't over. The work of creating a more just world never truly ended. But for now, in this moment, they had each other and a future they'd fought to create on their own terms, and that was everything.